Imagine telling millions of people do not judge, whilst operating one of the strictest judgment systems in modern religion. Imagine being told noticing a problem is the real problem. And imagine being warned against judgment by the very people who judge you, your family, your friends, and your future. If you are new here, welcome to Tell Me Dr. K, a channel manipulative religious leaders fear you will discover. I'm Dr. K, a theologian, consultant, and author. If you crave for deep dive that expose manipulation and cover-ups, subscribe and smash the notice bell so that when I upload another video, you'll receive a notification. Today I'm confronting one of the most weird talks on JW broadcasting. Do not judge.
The text for today is stop. Stop judging. That seems to indicate that it's happening, just as evidently it did in the first century when Jesus spoke those words. It's happening now. So we asked some questions about this particular series of verses in Matthew chapter 7. What is meant by judging? What's the straw? What's the rafter? And this expression in verse 2, measuring out, what's that all about?
But as we peel back the layers, the paradox emerges. An institution preaching against the environment it created itself. This video presents a series of clips from the JW talk, followed by critical commentary. We will explore three major themes: the meaning of judgment, the straw versus the rafter, the principle of measuring out, and finally, why this talk contradicts the Watchtower's own practices. 1. What is judging? The speaker explains that stop judging doesn't mean not making any judgments at all, but avoiding being overly critical, while also acknowledging that Jesus does require some judgments, identifying dogs, the narrow gate, and false prophets. Here is the clip.
Well, let's begin with the word judging itself. What does it mean? What does it not mean? Well, evidently it does not mean that we are to make no judgments whatsoever. That wouldn't be in harmony with what Jesus said actually later in chapter 7. You'll notice in verse 6, he mentions, do not give what is holy to dogs. In other words, those who don't appreciate spiritual things. We'd have to make a judgment. Is this person like that? Should I take the message elsewhere? Another judgment can be found here a little bit further down in verse 13. Jesus says, go in through the narrow gate, as opposed to the broad and spacious. Well, a person would have to make a judgment. Which is the narrow gate? And in verse 15, be on the watch for false prophets. Once again, who are they? A judgment is involved. So clearly, Jesus was not referring to any and all judgments that we have to make in harmony with his words here in chapter 7. The Watchtower pointed out very clearly that Jesus was referring to being judgmental or overly critical of others.
The speaker defines judgment as being overly critical. But notice something. He lists verses where Jesus commands discernment, identifying false prophets, choosing the right path, distinguish those who value spiritual things from those who don't. This selective framing blurs a crucial line: the difference between healthy discernment and suppression of critical thinking. In the Bible, Jesus challenges religious leaders openly. Paul publicly rebukes Peter. The Bereans question apostolic teaching. Scriptural judgment is not forbidden, it is expected. Yet inside the Watchtower system, judgment becomes anything that questions leadership's decisions, policies, or teachings. The speaker's message shifts from don't be harsh to don't question authority. Now, the first theme sets up the foundation for what is coming later. Not eliminating judgment, only controlling who is allowed to use it. Theme number 2, the straw, imagined flaws. The speaker describes straw as minor defects, real or imagined, such as personal opinions, difference in dress, grooming, dietary, or birthday guidelines. He warns against questioning others' motives or questioning organization rules. Here is the clip.
To any and all judgments that we have to make in harmony with his words here in chapter 7. The Watchtower pointed out very clearly that Jesus was referring to being judgmental or overly critical of others. So, how can we apply this counsel? Well, to do so, we have to understand our next question, and that is, what's the straw that he mentioned here in these verses? Well, the Watchtower explained concisely that the straw is any minor defect that we may notice in another person, that we seize upon to make a judgment or to view it critically. These little minor defects could be real, but they also might be imagined, as we'll see in just a moment. So, what's a minor defect? Well, a person may say something thoughtless or say something unkind. Well, isn't that true of virtually all of us? We all say things that we later regret. But the person who's judgmental or critical seizes upon that minor flaw and makes an issue out of it or tells about it to others. Or we might see what we think is a straw in another person's eye, and we judge that as a flaw. For example, personal opinions. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 10 referred to differing opinions. What was he addressing? Well, there was a problem in the first century congregation after the Mosaic law ended. Some were clinging to some of those traditions of the law. Well, if they had been Jews their entire life, perhaps it was hard for them to say the Sabbath was no longer to be kept. Or perhaps it was hard for them to accept that certain meats could now be eaten. But the reality is this: when the law ended, those things became optional. The kind of meat a person ate, even whether they chose to observe a certain day of the week for rest and worship. It was all now optional. So the problem was, though, as Paul wrote in Romans chapter 14, these different opinions were creating a problem. Some were judging others for their choices. Well, in reality, those had the right to make those individual choices since the Mosaic law no longer existed. So really, if a person made an issue about those things back then, it was an imaginary straw. Well, today, the same could happen with us. Every day, our brothers and sisters make differing choices. They make differing choices in their dress and grooming, the way they spend their money, their choices in food, health care. It may not be our choices, but do we have to make an issue about it? Do we have to become judgmental or critical? At Bethel, there are guidelines that have been established by the branch committee, the faithful and discreet slave here at Warwick. Do we really have all the facts as to why those guidelines were established? Or do we instantly become critical? Oh, I wonder why we have to do this or do that at Bethel. Well, again, very likely those guidelines were established with a good reason. So for us to assume that there's some sort of flaw in the guideline probably indicates we see an imaginary straw here at Bethel. Another example of an imaginary straw would be when we perhaps judge another person's motives. Motives are something, by definition, we cannot see on the surface. But we could misjudge someone if we become critical or judgmental. For example, a sister is outgoing, and we judge her as being flirtatious. Or a brother, perhaps an elderly brother, is shy. We judge him as being unfriendly or even mean. Well, how could we possibly know, right? It's just what a person sees on the surface. We're imagining a straw that really doesn't exist. And the same could be said with any situation. A person's appointed a regular pioneer, brother's a ministerial servant. Do we judge that person's motive or rejoice with them? It's true, some of our brothers and sisters may disappoint us at times, but the reality is we shouldn't assume their motives are bad. So what's the straw? It's a minor defect. An imperfection could be real, but often imagined.
Here is where the tone changes. The speaker moves from general principles directly into organization control. He labels questioning the organization rules as imagining a straw. He says if you see the problem with the guidelines from the faithful and discreet slave, the issue is not the rules, but it's you. But who decides what counts as a minor straw and a major straw? Who decides what is real and what is imagined? In practice, it is not the individual, it's the organization, it's the governing body. And here lies the contradiction. The Watchtower constantly points out minor flaws from its members. The same minor flaws that are not supposed to be a big issue. Dress, grooming, education choices, entertainment, vocabulary, music, to micromanaging decisions of its members.
They discourage any university education that is not in the trades.
So you need just enough to go by because, the world's going to end anyway.
There are also restrictions on what Jehovah's Witnesses should wear, what they watch, what they read, what they listen to, and the people they should surround themselves with.
I just kind of went in past the entryway and waited for him to get something. I saw his dad and his brother watching TV, and I remember the smells and the way it just I think as a kid I was frightened of it. I didn't know what was in there, what to expect.
While some witnesses may find solace in the organization's rigid ideology, others find it difficult to adhere to its rules, leading them to anxiety and depression.
My own doctor said he didn't have a single Jehovah's Witness patient that he saw that wasn't on antidepressants. Right? And that's a pretty common thing.
Those feelings of anxiety and depression are compounded by the fear that breaking the rules or leaving the organization will result in them being disfellowshipped and shunned by friends and family.
I never thought this could happen.
I didn't tell my parents, we'll put it that way. Somebody else did.
And that's because Jehovah's Witnesses, they're almost encouraged to rat on each other,
Absolutely, right? Yeah, they are. Police, to police them. Yeah. If you... Basically, what they tell you is if you've seen somebody do something and you didn't do anything about it, you are just as guilty in Jehovah's eyes by not doing the right thing and informing the elders.
Members are judged every time for non-scriptural issues, and yet the talk insists members should not do the same, especially not towards the leadership. This is not a counsel against judgment. It's a warning against questioning authority. I continue this deep dive to part 2, where I'm going to examine the remaining 2 themes. Now, if this deep dive made you to see the contradiction of the Watchtower Society clearly, like, subscribe, and smash the notice bell so that more people can learn about this contradiction. Talk about it. Let others see the other side of this talk, because truth is not strengthened by silence. It is strengthened by examination. And remember, questioning is not judgment. Seeking clarity is not rebellion. And thinking about yourself is never a flaw. Now, if you're interested in watching other videos where I've covered the allegation of the Jehovah's Witnesses abuses, click on this link. To watch part 2 of this expose, click on this link.